Thank you all for coming to this workshop on understanding by design. I know it can be a little bit difficult when it's at the end of the day and you have 50 things on your list of things to do. So I promise you that what we are doing today is not a nice thing to think about or a nice thing to try once, but can be a radical foundational change to how the entire school does its curriculum, so that students have the largest learning gains possible. That is what we're talking about today. Not something nice and fun we can try once and feel good about ourselves, but something absolutely radical and earth-shattering. First thing I'd like you to do is to think about what the outcome of understanding by design is. So before we start, let's get to the end in mind. Can you hold up this little survey that I gave you? This is actually a survey that can be given to students periodically to see how well their classroom is being aligned with the understanding by design pedagogy. And this is actually something we're giving in our economics department twice in this semester. On the right side is more of a traditional classroom that you would see in maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or 1995. However, the classroom that is described on the left, and there is a back as well, is what a classroom would look like that has truly embraced understanding by design. So I want you to just take a minute and read the two differences between a more traditional classroom and the one that uses understanding by design. Just take a minute, read what those two classes look like. You can take a few notes, and in a second I'm going to ask you to answer a few questions. Okay, what I'd like you to do is turn to someone sitting next to you and tell them which of these two classrooms would result in larger student gains of understanding. So in which classroom are students going to actually understand more? So actually internalize that knowledge more. Turn to your partner and tell them which classroom would do better at that and why. Go.
They take the responsibility. Here it's all about teacher-centered, here are student-centered. Where the students do not know how their work will be. Right, so it's teachers I remember one had a class. Whether it's a test or whatever. 20 years ago, they're going to have that.
Finish up your last thoughts. Okay, I'm going to bring us back together, and I just want a couple of thoughts from you. Which of these two classrooms is going to result in greater gains for student learning, and why? What are those things that you saw as stark contrast between a more traditional classroom and one that uses understanding by design? Adam.
Well, on the left side, obviously, I feel students are taking more responsibility in their learning where it's student-centered, and the right side was teacher-centered. Exactly.
We're trying to make, ultimately, we want as teachers to become irrelevant. We want them to become their own teachers, and us just be the ones to set up that learning environment. Aileen.
I also think the rubrics that students would have a hand in helping make or understanding less than not living in the dark, just trying to do what you as a teacher want them to do.
Absolutely. If we are in a classroom and we want to know how to be successful, the first thing we would want to know is, well, what does success look like? How do I know if I'm being successful? How can I assess myself? Absolutely. Other ideas?
Understanding by design, it gives the opportunity for students to get exposed to what standards are, what is criteria, what is rubric and how they can use the rubric. And it also fits with the 21st century learning skills. So basically, like, we're teaching students to become more independent and to gain like leadership skills for future.
Absolutely. One of the important things to think about is we're supposed to train students for the challenges of 2030. Not even today, not even 2005. We're trying to get them ready for jobs that don't even exist yet. And so the important thing is to make sure that they can be critical, independent thinkers. And having a classroom that's structured that way allows that to happen. So hopefully I've been able to show you that when you adopt this, there is a fantastic end in mind when this is used. So Unfortunately, my first year of teaching was on the complete opposite side. I taught like it was 2002, like my history teachers taught me. It was straight lecture, all day, every day. It was my first year of teaching. My goal was survive, and I just did what I was taught. I gave lectures and PowerPoints and multiple choice tests and maybe a little essay, and I tried to cover as much content as humanly possible, and I got them out of my class, and I said, job well done. Not that I ever thought about, what did they actually learn? Did I actually empower them to be their own teachers, to be their own learners, or did I just try to cram them with as much information as possible and hoped something stuck? And unfortunately, my first year of teaching, I don't think my kids actually really learned anything because I didn't design my classroom and my curriculum with them in mind. So here are outcomes in this little session. Now, just to let you know, this is one of 3 sessions that I'll be giving this year. The second will be the week of October 7th. But the goals for today is to understand the research base for why we do this. If there is not a legitimate research base on why we should do this, we're just wasting our time. The second thing is to understand how this can transform your students into, as Dr. John says, curious, independent, and critical thinkers. So we're hitting the academic mission of the school. We're going to understand how these plans are constructed as a tool for student growth and for teacher reflection. And lastly, I'm going to actually get you to do something. I'm going to have you actually practice crafting an essential question, an enduring understanding, or I know a lot of you already have learning standards, but actually using them to align those together. So those are the goals for today. So, if you do not want to read 5 different books from McTighe and Wiggins on understanding by design, I can craft all of it into one sentence. What their belief is that the point of education can be captured in a single phrase: worthy accomplishment achieved by causing thoughtful and effective understanding that enables transfer. That means they've been able to internalize our end goals, and they could transfer it and use it in a completely new context. It's the difference between a student being able to mirror a math formula problem, let's say simple integers, and the difference between them understanding why does that mathematical function exist, and how could they use that type of conceptual thinking in the real world. That's really the difference that we're looking for here. And what they say our job is as teachers is to cause understanding as reflected in worthy accomplishment. Now, they came out with this theory, and they've obviously expanded on it since then, in the early 2000s. But what we found is as research has evolved into the effectiveness in teaching and learning, UBDs and that approach have become even more important. One of the most paramount foundational research that has been done in the last 15 years is by John Hattie out of the University of Melbourne. And he looked at a meta-study, he performed a meta-study encompassing thousands and thousands of research papers over 50 plus countries, 50 million students, and he was able to categorize in about 250 different learning strategies the most and least effective for learning gains for students. Now, he has since revised that. I believe his last revision was in 2015. And I want you to take a look at what he says the most effective learning strategy for schools is. It's called collective teacher efficiency. It's the idea that as a learning community, we as educators work together and collaborate together to make sure our students are ultimately successful. That it doesn't matter if in the 2 years they're here at middle school, they can have completely different teachers for all different subjects, and we know that when they graduate, they have had the exact same learning outcomes. We can be confident that they have learned and mastered the same things. Now, what is that number you see over there? Well, based on the visible learning study, John Hattie determined that a score of a 0.4 would be considered 1 year of normal educational growth. So if you extrapolate that out, that is about 4 times more effective than a traditional year of growth if we do this. Under that are things like self-assessment, things like metacognition, students being able to think about their thinking and become their own teachers. That used to be the highest, but now it's at 1.33. Again, if we can get students to be their own teachers and internalize their own learning, that's when they have the largest learning gains. Now, John Hattie's work has influenced the current educational policies of Australia that actually recently redone federal standards over the last couple of years to reflect this research. But one of the more important educational educational theorist in the United States is Robert Lozano. He's written several books on teaching and learning. And what he says is that a guaranteed and viable curriculum is the #1 school-level factor impacting student achievement. Now, how can we take these two radical theories and put them together? Ultimately, the thing that results in the greatest student learning gains is not how many laptops they have or how many kids are in a classroom. It is the quality of the educator that is in that room. And what can ensure a high-quality educator is having a high-quality curriculum to make sure that we are using these research-based strategies to result in the greatest student learning. Now, how does UBD play into this? Understanding by design is the roadmap to have that viable, high-quality curriculum so that we are becoming the strongest educators that we can. That's how this all plays a part in that. Now, the important thing about UBDs, and what Wiggins and McTighe say, is that UBDs avoid the twin sins of curriculum. Now, just as a reminder, curriculum is not a list of standards or a textbook. I have a good friend who's a curriculum supervisor in Kuwait. He goes on a lot of accreditation trips. And he says that when he asks for curriculum, a lot of times school will just say, here's our standards, or here's the list of textbooks that we use. But that's not what curriculum is. When you think about that, that's a terrifying thought, that there are so many schools out there that don't actually know what curriculum is. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, it is the learning process students go through to demonstrate mastery of standards. It is the start to end finish to make sure they have demonstrated mastery on those things we've said are important. Now, the twin sins of curriculum that UBDs avoid for us is one, covering as much content as humanly possible. That is what I did my first year of teaching, and I'm sure if my students went and took a US history class in college, the professor would have to reteach them a lot of stuff, because they never internalized it in the first place. Now, the second twin sin of teaching, which seems a little bit cruel, is doing a lot of really fun, exciting activities, but they have no basis in any sort of educational outcome. It's great that, and here's another story from myself. Again, I have made every mistake in the book. My second year of teaching, I was teaching 7th grade, and we were learning about the Roman Empire. And I thought, you know what would be really fun? If I dress up like a Roman soldier, and I make this armor out of cardboard, and I get them to throw paper balls at me like they're arrows, and I'll talk about being a Roman soldier, I'll get them to march and get in formation. It'll be really, really fun. But it had nothing to do with the learning outcomes we had for that unit. And so realistically, although they had fun, it wasn't tied to any of our learning standards. I actually wasted that time with them, unfortunately, when I could have actually been targeting those things that we as a school said were important. Now, I also want to say this. Why should we, as a school at King's Academy, actually care about doing this, embracing this, implementing this? We're getting accredited in 2 years. The accreditation team's coming for a short visit next year, and then they're actually doing their accreditation visit in 2 years. We are being assessed using NEASC ACES accreditation standards. I want you to take a look at one of the foundational standards that they call learning structure. The school has in place clear statements that express a definition of learning and a set of learning principles and objectives that shape and drive its program practices. A curriculum articulating learning outcomes, expected teaching practices, and principles of assessment exists. We need to have a structure so that when the accreditation team comes, we can say not only here are all of our learning outcomes for every single subject in our school, but we know what assessments we will give to make sure they've hit those learning outcomes so that we're confident that we have that viable curriculum. They're going to look at this, and we need to be able to give them evidence of that. But what if you're not too concerned about an accreditation standard? That's a little bit above your pay grade to worry about that. Why should you care as a first or second year teacher? Well, your second year here, you get evaluated. And under the second component of teacher evaluation are, I believe, 2 or 3 rows specifically about backwards design and using it. Now, unfortunately, we don't do training on backwards design, which is what UBDs are actually perfecting in a way. So if we want to make sure that we're being evaluated and that we can be the best teachers we want to be, we need to know this structure for ourselves as people who are going to be evaluated as teachers at King's Academy. So, I want to go over briefly some of UBD's key tenets. I'm not going to read these out loud. We are all intelligent professionals. We can all read. But I want to tell you some things about what UBDs are and are not. Okay. UBDs are not prescriptive. Anytime someone comes out with a new educational policy, we all get very scared as teachers because we don't like being told what to do. UBDs do not tell you how you need to teach a class every single day. All it says is that we as a school collectively decide what we want our learning outcomes to be, what assessments will make sure those learning outcomes happen, and then it gives you the freedom as teachers to prepare them for those assessments. So it's not saying that we have to use some sort of jigsaw method, or we have to use lecturing, or we have to use some sort of hardness discussion, or we have to use some sort of flipped classroom, or a web quest, or differentiated instruction, or authentic learning. It gives you the freedom to design that class for those same learning outcomes and assessments. But it allows you, because we're all different, to be professionals and have some autonomy. This, again, is all about student learning. We want the highest outcomes for our students. That is why we're here. And understanding is revealed when students can autonomously make sense of that learning process. So I'm going to give you an example. In my economics class, we just did our first assessments. And the first thing we talked about were the 5 foundations of economic thinking. Incentives, opportunity costs, trade-offs, marginal thinking, and trade. Now, if all I did was say, can you define all of those, that doesn't tell me they've learned anything. That doesn't tell me they can apply it in a new context. So during that assessment day, they came in and I handed them a piece of paper that explained how co-curricular sign-ups work. And I said, using the 5 foundations of economics, which ones are present specifically in the current co-curricular structure? And then create a possible solution to make a more fair system using those same foundational theories. Now, students, to be prepared for that, had to know more than just what the definitions were. They had to be able to see it in the real world. They had to be able to explain it. And in that assessment, they could choose any method. Some did typed analyses, some did slideshows, some just wrote reports so that they could express that information, so they could express their understanding. I had one student who came by and said, that was the most different exam I've ever had. And I said, why? He said, because I had to prove to you that I learned it. Some other key tenets. Again, effective curriculum is planned backwards. We always think about the end goals first, and then we work to the day-to-day. We are coaches. Ultimately, this makes us irrelevant. We can actually spend time making sure the students are learning, not we are the ones who are learning. This also allows us to have a continuous improvement plan. The economics team, as we're going through our units, are always thinking about, did we actually achieve those educational objectives that we had? Did our assessment actually connect to that? Did the standards-based rubric that we use, did it actually have clear proficiency levels for those things? It allows us to then go back and alter it for next year. Or, let's say we all have to leave for some reason, whoever's coming in next has a very clear vision of what the economics class at King's is, not Mr. Muller's class. Now, I probably talked about setting up what UBDs are for a while, so I want to tell you what it actually looks like. There are 3 stages to it, and if you want to see what a template looks like, it's this blank handout that you picked up. There are 3 stages to UBDs. And again, it starts with the end goal in mind. Now there are many different types of templates for UBDs. This is one that has been specifically adapted in conjunction with some of my consultants by me, considering where we currently are. And it starts off with the learning standards that we have. We can call them learning standards, we can call them mastery standards, we can call them learning objectives, it doesn't matter. When the students finish this unit, what are they going to actually be able to master? What can they analyze? What can they synthesize? What can they apply in these settings? That's the first thing we have to think about. We think about the end in mind. Then what we do is we think about something called enduring understandings and essential questions. Things that as they go through the unit, questions that are constantly asked in our discipline, they'll be able to uncover. Understandings that they'll be able to internalize for the rest of their life will be uncovered. We're going to talk more about that in a second. After that, you list knowledge and skills, basic things they need to know, basic skills they'll practice. And that's stage 1. It is so that when students start that unit, we can tell them, here are our end goals in mind for you, here's what we want you to have the outcomes for, and it can direct everything we're doing as a school. The second stage is about assessments. What assessments are going to be specifically targeted for mastery of those learning standards. Now, those can be performance tasks, those can be authentic, differentiated projects that we're asking students to do. For instance, in economics, when students are learning about elasticity, which is how much do people's buying patterns change when the price of a good goes up, we're actually going to change the prices of a bunch of the goods in the gazia and see what the buying patterns of those goods are, and we're going to give it to students and say, calculate the elasticity, and then make a recommendation to the operations department on if they should actually increase those goods. We're going to be able to tell if they have that outcome. It can also be different summative assessments, traditional summative assessments you would think about. And then lastly, you think about your formative assessments. So what are those little checks that we're doing often in class to make sure they're prepared for those summative assessments? Things like review questions, things like Kahoot quizzes, things like pair sharing activities, things like little mini quizzes we can do. Stage 3, and it's that big thing at the very end, it's the learning plan. It could be day to day, it could be week to week, but it's basically what are we actually doing in class so that they can be prepared for those summative assessments, which are aligned to the learning outcomes that we have for them. Now, the great thing about this is if for some reason we all have to leave and new people all come into the middle school, we have something to give those new people to make sure that they are aware of what our classes look like. Now, again, the one thing that you have autonomy of as teachers is stage 3. Okay? Again, this is not restricted. Everyone does not have to do the same thing every day in the history department. So stage 3 allows for that teacher autonomy that we can have here. So that is what UBDs are actually structured on. I want to spend some time talking about enduring understandings and essential questions, and then I'm going to actually get you guys to talk and do some work here. These are what enduring understandings are. If you would like to know some examples, in this handout, it's two-sided. One has examples of essential questions, and one has examples of enduring understandings. Notice there are enduring understandings I've listed for almost every discipline that I think can be here. English, social sciences, language, art, science, math, things like that. So take a look at the ones that are listed here for your department. And you can take a look at some of the characteristics that we have up here for enduring understandings. And as you're reading this, I want you to think about how important this are, because enduring understandings are the why that students constantly ask us. Why are we here? Why am I learning this? Why is that important? Which, to be fair, is a valid question from our kids. So these enduring understandings are the whys that we're doing. Why do we have to learn how to conjugate French verbs in the past tense? Why do we have to know how to divide fractions? Why do we have to know how to do tone in an English class? Why do we have to know the difference between upstage and downstage in drama? This allows us to tell them, here's why you're here. These are really great mini, day-to-day learning objectives. If you ever want to put that in your opening slides, say learning intention, and you throw that enduring understanding on there. Okay, we want them to actualize their own learning. Okay. So what I'd like you to do, and if you want some examples of what enduring understandings are and are not, here are a few for you. Again, my first years of teaching, I was always thinking like this, and not thinking like this. Okay, so we're doing actually very good with time. We're at here 4:15, correct? Okay. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes, and what I'd like you to do is meet with your department. And I'd like you to think about the current unit that your department is in. And I want you to try and make a few enduring understandings for what your department is currently doing. Answer the why question of your learning outcomes. Because you all have learning standards that you've articulated. So write down the why. Why are they learning that? Give you 5 minutes. Meet with your departments, try to write down 1 or 2 enduring understandings, and then we'll share them together. Okay, I'm going to bring us back together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a few people to share some of their enduring understandings. And again, a great way to test this is to not only look at the exemplars that I provide for you, but take a look at these characteristics. Are the things that you mentioned for your department reflecting these things? Some of the other things I asked you is, once you develop one, does that learning standard you're working on, does that enduring understanding encompass all of that learning standard, or do you need to have a few enduring understandings for those learning standards? Just something to reflect on. So let's hear some of the enduring understandings that I've been hearing as I was going around. Let's go with the group in the back. So what was the enduring understanding you created?
Okay. So we're talking about literature. So for me, I'm teaching now translation literature, word literature, and Muntaha is teaching Arab literature. So basically, we are going to answer the question why I need to learn literature. So it's not about just to come with a definition about literature, and it's really something in depth that literature tells us a lot of culture. This is what we need. It's all about culture.
So what you're trying to, what you would say is that students should understand that literature reveals culture.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Let's go with the social sciences. Any enduring understandings you're able to calculate?
Yeah, I'd say we both share why we study the past. What's the purpose of history in preparing us for the present and how's it future?
Okay, so students should understand that examining history reveals or prepares them for the problems of the future.
Yeah.
Okay. And you would just have to look at this and say, okay, now is that meeting those characteristics that we're looking for? Let's go with the arts department. Everyone forgets about the arts department, but I think the teaching methods that the arts provide are some of the more advanced in all of the subjects. Go ahead.
Okay, so students should understand that art can exist anywhere.
Okay. Students will understand that art exists everywhere. It's uncoverable. Applicable to a new situation. It's not just a content goal, it's specific and insightful, and you have the option for it to be topical or overarching, to be interdisciplinary. Let's go with our lovely team up front.
We are enduring our understanding for the chapter we're covering right now in 8th grade math, which is exponents, is to understand that manipulating exponents is a tool that they can use in the future to help them analyze non-traditional numbers. Because for 7th or 8th graders right now, traditional numbers are normal numbers. Anything to the power of 2 or times 10 to the power of 20 is something too complex for them.
Okay. So students should understand that exponents allow them to analyze what kind of numbers did you say?
We wrote it as non-traditional numbers.
Non-traditional numbers. Okay. And that's something they would have to uncover by actually doing that subject. Okay? So that's one of those outcomes that we can test for. In an actual classroom, an easy way to do that is after an assessment, ask them to reflect on what they've learned throughout that unit and see if they say some of these things. Or you can ask it as a closure question after a couple of class periods to see if they can articulate that. There are things we can do to make sure that this is happening by just talking to our students. So, that's enduring understandings. Let's talk briefly about essential questions. Now, essential questions are connected directly to enduring understandings themselves. And again, I'm not going to read these characteristics out for you, but I'd just like you to take a look at what are some of these characteristics of essential questions. To take these characteristics and to condense them down, essential questions are things that are always asked in our discipline. It doesn't have a black and white, easy answer. It's something where the answers can consistently and constantly change based on the situation. It's something that is debated in the disciplines. And it's funny because a lot of times we don't ask them essential questions in class. We make them assume that classrooms are just, there is one answer to every question and nothing gets debated. When let's be honest, in almost every one of our disciplines, there are things that are constantly being debated in our academic community. So we should expose them to those things. So some examples and non-examples, and I'll show you one because it's economics, I believe. Nope, that was the enduring understandings. So let's take a look at how many minutes are in an hour, or how many hours are in a day. That's a black and white answer. It's something we would ask on a quiz, but it's not an essential question. But to make that into an essential question, we could say, how would life be different if we couldn't measure time? Because that really unearths the idea of why do we add quantitative numerals to time that we exist. It's something that is constantly asked in life. It's something that's asked in disciplines. And it gives them this mindset of curiosity and investigation. So now I'm going to ask you to do something a little bit harder than what I did before. I want you to take the enduring understanding that you wrote down, just one of them, and I want you to say, if students were able to uncover that enduring understanding and internalize that enduring understanding, what essential question is being asked with that enduring understanding? Okay. Again, here are the characteristics. You've got lots of examples. If you want to take a look at your handout, there are examples of essential questions up here for every discipline. I'm going to give you about 5-10 minutes. See if you can create an essential question out of the enduring understanding that you made. Okay? Take 5-10 minutes.